I consider myself a logical person, but don't we all? And on one hand, I love my children and I want them to live their best lives. And if that includes starting a family, I wouldn't want to talk them out of it. But on the other hand, I don't want to be wrong. So I reached out to the most popular antinatalist, David Benatar, author of Better Never to Have Been, and I wanted to hear his response to the arguments I received from pronatalists. Why do people have such a hard time accepting antinatalist conclusions or antinatalism as a whole? Why is there such a barrier, do you think?
Biology. I think there are eons of evolutionary history of which we are the product. And that is going to militate in most cases, not of course with all people, we're going to have exceptions, but in general, in the human species, that's going to militate against acceptance of antinatalist ideas.
How bad is procreation when you compare it to, heinous moral crimes like murder or something that's, almost not even an unethical thing like a white lie or something?
The problem with that question, I think, is that it could be understood in different ways. If we are thinking about a murder, for example, it's not simply the wrongfulness of the killing that people think about. They also think about the blameworthiness of the murderer, because all of us should know that murdering people is wrong. Now, when it comes to something like procreation, where the antinatalist idea is really a very minority idea, most people are never even exposed to that idea, we probably are not going to attach high levels of blame to people who procreate. And so if I make a claim about the wrongfulness of the action, somebody might construe that as a claim about the blameworthiness of the action. How wrong it is for me would depend on how bad the child's life is. And sometimes you can tell in advance that the child's going to have a very bad life. Sometimes you might have good reason for thinking that it would have a less bad life than the norm. But it's in the nature of these things that one can never be sure about what's going to happen. In fact, there are very high levels of uncertainty about what would happen to any child that one produced. And so you really are playing a kind of roulette when you procreate. But the objective wrongness of it, I think, would depend on how severe that harm is. That would be different from the blameworthiness.
A lot of people might have trouble with the idea that the parent of the genetic anomaly kid, is he morally worse than the parent who procreated and kind of got lucky? I think a lot of people in the audience, will struggle to make that connection.
Oh, yes. Well, this is the phenomenon of what's known as moral luck. And it doesn't appear only in this context. So let's imagine that you're driving and you take your eyes off the road for a moment and you hit a child. And the child dies. Well, you've done a terrible thing. You've killed the child. Whereas somebody else might take their eyes off the road for a moment and they're lucky. Nobody steps into the road and they don't hit anybody. So they've both done exactly the same thing. One had a terrible consequence, another didn't. And in fact, this phenomenon of moral luck really pervades our life. Another instance of it would be procreation.
I presented the arguments against antinatalism from my interview with Brian Kaplan in the Collinses.
Asymmetry is nonsense. Failure to get a good thing is actually, in principle, just as bad as the experiencing of a bad thing. And the prudent thing is to net, to sum. Full stop, iron line in the sand. No reasonable person would ever think otherwise, and only a weird dogma would get you off on some other track.
The absence of benefit is not bad if there is nobody to be deprived of the benefit. And I'm quite explicit that if there is somebody who is deprived of the benefit, then it is bad. So if you fail to win the lottery, or you fail to get some pleasure that you could have got, that is bad because you're there and you're deprived of the benefit that you would otherwise have had. But if the reason why there's no pleasure is because there's no being to have the pleasure, that's what I'm saying is not bad.
And I think a lot of people misinterpret your argument. They make the leap that life is good, and therefore, if you miss out on life, you're missing out on something good. The trouble with this, in my mind, is you're talking about someone who doesn't exist. So you're having to make this case that something that doesn't exist is missing out, which is the conundrum.
There's a separate argument about how good or bad life is. And I think what you were doing in your representation was starting off with the assumption that life is good, and then saying that people are going to be deprived of that good. But there are two questions, really. The one is, how good or bad is life? And the other question is the question about the axiological asymmetry.
I informed Benatar about the conversation I was going to have with my children. I told him how I was going to introduce the concept that even the greatest pleasures or goods in life do not outweigh the worst sufferings or harms. The lion's pleasure in feasting on the zebra pales into comparison to the zebra's intense suffering as it's being eaten alive.
So let me just clarify. So I'm not making the claim that some good could never outweigh pain, because we do make these judgments in our life. We do. For example, we take the shot in order to prevent something much worse from happening later. And I'm not denying the rationality of that. All I'm saying is that if we look at the nature of things like pleasure and pain, or the satisfaction of desires and the dissatisfaction of desires, there is an empirical asymmetry between them. It's not that we can never do comparisons and never do trade-offs that involve some pain. It's just that on balance, we've got very good reason for thinking that there's going to be more negative than positive.
And I also asked Benatar what he thought of implied or hypothetical consent when making decisions about procreation.
If you've got somebody, let's say, who's unconscious on the street, you can't access their wishes because they're unconscious. And in fact, you don't even need to work on the basis of hypothetical consent, that they would have consented if they could have. It might be sufficient that it's likely in their best interests for you to administer treatment. So think about not cases of adults who are lying on the street, but newborn babies who require medical treatment. Consent makes no sense in a context like this, because this child couldn't give consent even if it were fully conscious. It couldn't give consent as a child. There's no preferences of this being to access, but the standard that we normally use in scenarios like this is what's called the best interest standard. So you do what is going to be in the best interests of somebody. And if this is an already existing being, it's likely in their interest to continue existing, unless that's outweighed, let's say, by the suffering that they're going to endure. And that's what would justify the treatment. But if you're speaking about a being that has not been brought into existence, it suffers no harm if it's not brought into existence. And so the idea that you're now going to benefit this being by creating the being is completely disanalogous from the other kinds of case.
Many people, many of the viewers are going to be asking themselves, well, I've experienced so many things in my life. You know, I've had good things, I've had bad things, and maybe tomorrow I'll get a terminal diagnosis, or I'll get hit by a bus, or something more horrific like some kind of liver problem that takes years and it's, terrible death. And they would say, I'm okay with that. Why is that not justification to create a new life?
Well, think about somebody who genetically engineered a contented slave. So they decided that they would produce a child, but they do some genetic engineering on the child that they implant, on the embryo that they implant, such that this person who's produced will be a servile, but a contentedly servile person. So they've been engineered to be this way. Would it be morally acceptable to produce a class of contented slaves? I think very few of us would say that it is. And that is because the life of a slave is not a good life. And the fact that it is sort of genetically adapted to being happy in that condition would not provide us with a license to produce that slave. And I think that what's going on in procreation is we don't have human genetic alteration of the beings that come into existence. But what we have is an evolutionarily constructed genome, as it were, that is going to incline people towards accepting their condition, their human condition. And I don't think the fact that people endorse this makes it justifiable. So the suggestion was that although you're bringing this child into existence without the child's consent, if the child turns out not to be happy with his or her life, they've always got the choice of taking their own lives, of engaging in suicide. And they found the idea that you'd want to avoid somebody having to make that decision as morally monstrous. And I think the opposite is morally monstrous. I think it underestimates a few things. First of all, it underestimates lots of people's access to painless suicide, painless and effective suicide. So it may be that in some parts of the world now, some states in the US and in Canada and a few other places, Switzerland, that you can get access to medically assisted dying, and it can be a relatively painless and effective procedure. But there are many other people who are going to have to choose some alternative self-administered way of suicide. And it might be either ineffective or it might be painful. And so it's not a real option that everybody has. And secondly, even if you do have the option of medically assisted suicide, given the life drive that people have, you have to reach immense levels of pain, psychic pain, before you're going to take your life. And even then, you're going to be racked with concerns about what you would do to people who leave behind. This is an immensely weighty decision. And to put somebody into a position like that is vastly different from not creating them in the first place. But you've now asked me about this person who's unconscious and needs help. And I don't think that that is an analogy for the procreation case. Because when you have an unconscious person, they already exist. And they have an interest in continuing to exist. And so when you administer that help to them, you're doing what is likely in their best interests. Whereas when you're contemplating procreation, there's not a being that exists there. And if I'm correct about the asymmetry argument, the axiological asymmetry argument, it's not in their interest to come into existence. And that's the fundamental disanalogy between the rescue case and the case of procreation.